Thank you, Luke, and thank you, Anthony, for that warm-up. I'm not sure about the approval rating. Next year, 2020, for those of you familiar with my work, is the 10th anniversary of my swearing off any commentary at all that mentioned the word news poll. It was the 2010 election where I finally broke the poll habit. I mean, I covered it all the way through and then realised after the fact that the polls were a really cheap way of covering federal politics. It's taken some colleagues a little longer than others to share my epiphany, but others did do it at the time. Pay my respects firstly before we begin to Indigenous elders, past, present and emerging. And I want to begin. I was a bit intimidated by the slideshow, and I'm glad I didn't bring slides because I would have spent half the time looking backwards, and now I see a video which is even more intimidating. But I want to begin by with an overview of the federal election just been. I don't want to talk about politics, but I want to talk about where the public sits. And then we've, from the federal election result, some of the things that are driving cultural change, economic change, changes in our identity across the continent, and you work out really quickly what the impact is in the tertiary sector. The election itself obviously was a surprise because both parties went into it expecting a government that had sacked itself twice already would be voted out. Now, the government had sacked itself, a previous government had sacked itself twice, and when it appeared before the people with a third Prime Minister in 6 years, that was Labor in 2013, they were thrown out in a landslide. So the assumption was, when Malcolm Turnbull was rolled last year, that the coalition would end up the same way Labor did. Lose your first Prime Minister, lose your majority. That was the journey from Rudd to Gillard in 2010. A parallel journey from Abbott to Turnbull between the 2013 and 2016 elections. So the assumption was this election that the coalition would get smashed as Labor's was smashed in 2013. Most of us missed the result. I'm one to admit I just thought the pattern had already been established, and most of the coalition people I'd been speaking to expected to lose. Labor were already banking the win and starting to discuss things like appointments, which is usually a sign either of complacency or the election was already over. Some of you might remember Scott Morrison's campaign launch, and that was at that point the biggest tell for people in the political space. There was literally no Liberal bunting on the stage because Turnbull and Abbott couldn't be expected to sit next to each other at a campaign launch. They weren't invited in the first place, which meant that John Howard had to be disinvited too. So effectively what had happened, Scott Morrison had disappeared his government over the course of that election campaign, and sharing the stage with him that day at the launch was Sarah Henderson, who was then the holder of a very marginal seat, Corangamite, which is the back end of Geelong. And so we were all looking at Victoria to decide the election. They were all the signals we were getting. The thing that Scott Morrison did, and he did very effectively, was in disappearing his government, he made the election a referendum on Labor and especially Bill Shorten. And he made the point when the election was called that if you vote for me, you get me as Prime Minister, but if you vote for Labor, you get Bill Shorten as Prime Minister. So in the end, it was a very, very standard incumbent, can't play to its record, can only run a scare campaign against the opposition. Complacent opposition assumed it already won and didn't make the case. Now that side of it is understood. It's how the votes broke down, it's how you break down the votes where the real story for me was. The election result in 2019 repeated patterns in 2016 and 2010. In essence, we've now had the same election over the course of an entire decade. Labor won a majority of seats in Melbourne and in Sydney. It also won a majority of seats in Victoria and New South Wales when the regions were counted up. It won a majority of seats in South Australia and Tasmania and the two territories, in 4 states and in 2 territories, across the inner metropolitan area, across the outer metropolitan area and the provincial parts of Australia, provincial seats, places like Newcastle and the like. Labor was the majority party across the board. Now, in the past, if you had won Sydney and Melbourne, you'd bridged the foundational divide in Australia, where the biggest chips on the shoulder are in terms of our federation between those two cities. Arguments about free trade versus protection, arguments about AFL versus rugby league, all the things we've grown up knowing that divided those two cities. They united for Labor in 2010, 2016 and 2019, but weren't able to deliver a majority Labor government. Now, in the past, if you could unite Melbourne and Sydney, and Menzies did it, and Hawke did it, you'd win in a landslide. So something that obviously shifted over the course of the last 10 years. And it's more apparent now that the last election that we had put aside all the other stuff about the referendum between ScoMo and Bill Shorten, to use the jargon, the guy in the baseball hat versus the guy with the uncomfortable jogging outfit, if I could put it politely. Put all that to one side and think about how the votes broke down. Now, I divide the country into three zones for the purposes of this exercise. The southeast, which is New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT. That's the cosmopolitan southeast. The frontier states, Queensland and WA, and then the rest, which is the outsiders. South Australia, Tasmania, the two poorest states, and the Northern Territory. I'll put the ACT in the bottom corner. Now, I'll just find these numbers for you so you know I haven't made them up. It'll take 2 seconds to locate them. I'll go back to 2010. So this is Gillard versus Abbott. Melburnian Labor leader, Sydney-sider coalition leader. Out of the 87 seats in New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT, Labor won 50, the coalition won 34, others 3. I'll go to South Australia, Tasmania and NT. There are only 18 seats there. Labor have won 11 out of the 18. So a majority in 4 of the 6 states and the 2 territories. In Queensland and Western Australia, now this is very familiar because we've seen this again in 2019, but I'll give you the 2010 result. Labor 11, coalition 33, others 1 out of 45. So Labor's majority in the 4 states and the 2 territories are cancelled by a super coalition majority in the 2 frontier states, Western Australia and Queensland. Mind you, in Perth and in Brisbane, it's a score draw. It's the regions, it's the electorates outside of Perth and outside of Brisbane that decided that Gillard wasn't going to have a majority government. Now, in 2019, Labor wins 40 out of the 88, so there's an extra seat now in the southeast, and it wins 9 out of the 17. There's 1 fewer seat. South Australia lost a seat in redistribution. Same story. Then we go to Queensland and WA. They've got 11, like they did in 2010. The coalition have got 1 more, they've got 34, and there's 1 other. Now that country reminds us now, when we think conceptually, of the Brexit story, which is London, Manchester, Liverpool vote to remain in the EU, Scotland votes to remain, Northern Ireland votes to remain, England, but driven by the rest of England outside the metropolitan area, and Wales votes to leave. Trump's lost the East Coast and the West Coast, where most of the economic activity is. So 2/3 of GDP is in Democrat territory in 2016, 1/3 of GDP, where the Electoral College gets him a majority, is in the Midwest, is in the Rust Belt, is in the South. Canada, and this is quite interesting because Canada has just repeated exactly this story. Metropolitan areas have voted for a second-term Trudeau government. Quebec's gone in a different direction, and Conservatives have sort of risen again in the frontier territories. Cities versus regions. Now, cities versus regions is something in the education space that you understand this argument. You turn up at a Melbourne Uni campus or a Sydney Uni campus, you just have to open the door and students are rushing in. Government walks around and tells you that we'd like to be able to balance the population equation between city and region. We want to get some of the campuses in the regions fired up. Now, I'm holding that thought because I might get a question on it, but I just want you to think when I go from the political to the structural story, what is driving this polarisation in the Australian electorate and why it's a little different to the US, UK and Canada Not too different, but why it's a little different. We'll think about some of the policy implications for education. Now, this particular part of the story is what is the biggest population story in Australia today. The thing that's driving the sort of growth in the southeast and the separation of the frontier states from the rest of the country. Now, in a word, it's migration. But there's two types of migration we can talk about. We can talk about internal migration, so people leaving the regions for the cities, and people leaving cities to go to regions. So young people coming to the cities and retirees moving the other direction. And of course, we can also talk about overseas migration. Now, it didn't matter where you lived in the 20th century, whether you're in a migrant hotspot or a very, very small migrant centre with a very, very large Australian-born population. It didn't matter where you lived. The ethnic face in the city and the region was almost identical. The English were number one everywhere, and pretty much everywhere after the Second World War, the Italians were number two, and then from the 70s onwards, the New Zealanders were number two. Now, we're only holding the first two as an idea of what the ethnic face of Australia is. This is sort of the migrant part of our ethnicity. And in 2001, 6 of the 8 capital cities matched the national picture, which was English 1, New Zealanders 2. The two exceptions were Melbourne and Adelaide, where the Italians were still number 2. So that's 2001. Come the census in 2016, and this is a census that obviously I've mined a fair bit for storytelling purposes, but each time I look at the data, I always find another little quirk in it. The 2016 census had the English at 1 and the New Zealanders at 2, but in 4 of the 8 capital cities, someone other than the English were number 1. Now, for the first time in our settler history, this happened. You start the north. In Darwin, migrants from the Philippines are number 1, they've overtopped the English. In Brisbane, migrants from New Zealand have overtopped the English, they're number 1. In Sydney, migrants from China are number 1, they've overtopped the English. And in Melbourne, migrants from India have overtopped the English. Now, demographers, Peter McDonald will tell you this especially, Melbourne tends to lead every demographic trend in Australia. Melbourne was the first capital city that went below replacement rate for its birth rate in the 70s. And the replacement rate for our fertility rate is 2 babies per woman, 1 for mum and 1 for dad. The baby boom, as Peter Costello reminded us, was the 3rd one for the country. Now the one graph, and this is the one graph I would have shown, but I can describe it. I've used these gangly arms to explain it to you. Our birth rate fell off the cliff in the mid-70s, and it started falling off the cliff in Melbourne. We went below replacement rate in 1976, and we've been below replacement rate ever since. So birth rate, you imagine your post-war story, boomers up to 3 point something in the 60s, falls off a cliff in the 70s, and by 76 through to today, it's under 2. Now, the implications of a lower birth rate, we've been talking a lot about the ageing of the population. But in my days in Canberra, we used to talk about the ageing of the population in terms of how many taxpayers, the ratio of taxpayers to retirees. The story in this last decade is, and this is where the changing ethnic face in Australia makes more sense to me when I describe it this way. Birth rate comes off, but the first of the baby boomers are retiring in 2011. So the first of the baby boomers are reaching retirement age in 2011, and the generation after them doesn't have as many kids as their parents did. So we've got gaps opening in the labour market. Not literally for every boomer there isn't, for every boomer that retires there isn't a local-born worker to replace them. The economy is growing, so you need more than just the worker to replace the boomer that retires. But what's happened since 2011, since the boomers have began to exit the labour market, with the first of them turning 65? The migration number has accelerated. So last quarter of the 20th century, between 80 and 100,000 permanent settlers a year in Australia, and that tended to be the average over the course of the second half of the 20th century. And in proportionate terms, because the population is growing, we're actually getting a lower migration rate in the 90s than we had in any other decade after the Second World War. That 80 to 100,000, majority are under the family reunion program. And in fact, on your campuses, you wouldn't have been talking about foreign students being revenue driver, being, predominant student body. This wasn't the conversation we were having with the migration program in the 20th century. People like my parents started at the bottom, and you measured their sort of success in Australia through home ownership and small business. And you measured the success of the program through the second generation, the educational attainment of the Australian-born kids. That story, as we know, is a very familiar story. You almost have to forget all that to understand the drivers of population and migration in the 21st century. Because since we switched to a demand-driven model, and John Howard did this in the early part of the 2001-2002, the number of migrants who are settling permanently each year has doubled. So from 80 to 100,000 until recently it moved up to 190. Now that graph goes this way as the birth rate goes that way, trust me, and it accelerates when the boomers start exiting the labour market. So in the decade just been, in the decade we're closing now, we go to 190,000 a year at the peak. So let's average it back 10 to 180. So you go from 80 to 100 to 180, that extra 100 are all skilled migrants. So we go from predominant family reunion migration in the end of the 20th century to 2/3 of an elevated migration program, and numbers that we haven't seen before, an elevated migration program, 2/3 are skilled. So they don't start where my parents start, they land in a tertiary institution, or they land in a skilled job, or they land in a hospital in a region. So you don't wait for the second generation, the Australian-born non-English migrants. We pop them at the top of our social ladder on arrival. Now that has extraordinary integration challenges for the country, because you almost have to accelerate the integration process. You can't wait for the kids. And again, it's another thought. I don't want to prompt the questions too specifically, but there are a couple of things you need to think about already. Now, it's the distribution of those skilled migrants where the big story is. Now, I mentioned before that 4 of the 8 capitals now no longer have the English at number 1. Since 2001, there have been 500,000 Chinese added to the Chinese-born population in Australia, and another 500,000 Indians. That's between 2001 and 2018. So between those two rising nations, 1 million net addition to the migrant population in Australia, 1 million. The third largest group are from the Philippines, just under 200,000. The English aren't even in the top 10, and we know why they're not in the top 10, because that cohort is ageing. Their median age is now pushing towards 60 years of age. More than half are already retirees. Almost half are already retirees. The Chinese and Indians are landing predominantly in just 2 cities, here and in Sydney. 3/4 of all the Chinese in Australia live in just Melbourne and Sydney, and 2/3 of all the Indians in Australia live in just Melbourne or Sydney. Predominant Indian tilt in Melbourne, predominant Chinese tilt in Sydney. Now, governments look at these numbers and say, how do we get them to the regions? Now, migrants are not going to go to the regions if there isn't work there. Migrants aren't going to go to the regions if there isn't an established community there. If you want to bring migrants to a region, you pretty much have to recruit a new group. And there are a number of countries that are ready to give up their young in service of Australia's standard of living. And I'm sure we can find them if we went looking. But one of the dangers, and I talk a lot about this to government, one of the dangers at the moment is because we're in a buyer's market, people are turning up, we're running a demand-driven program, and they're concentrating in just 2 cities, and then we complain. Well, because we're not recruiting, because we're not thinking systemically about population, land use and all the other issues. We sort of have the best of one world, which is a demand-driven program, and the worst of the other world, which is we don't know what happens when one of those groups stops coming or they go home. Now, I alluded earlier, obviously, to the difference in the electorate. Now, I described the polarisation that we saw at the last election, which is a polarisation that's run through the last decade, as a disengaged polarisation. It's not an active polarisation the way we have in the US, Like that election campaign we've just had didn't feel like the country was about to catch fire. In fact, that was one of the criticisms of that campaign. There didn't seem to be anything at stake, which is not a bad thing when you think about it. But the separation of those two frontier states from the southeast, the separation of frontier states from the two largest cities in the country, from the two cities where all the economic action is, where all the diversity is, that can't last. So sooner or later, something's going to snap, and the southeast is going to figure out a way to attain power, to reattain power. When that happens, the concern, and my concern has always been this concern, that the southeast is going to operate on a winner-take-all basis and not worry about the regions. And the incentives for them to think that way, we've seen it in the last 10 years in the way politics has been conducted. They're the elites, they're not real Australia, stop the boats and all those other things. It's very difficult to tell a group of voters who keep getting it wrong at a federal election that when they finally get it right, that they ought to forgive the other side. And this isn't a Labor or Liberal thing. This is a new Australia versus old Australia conversation I'd like you to think about. Now, working through that election polarisation, which looks at the moment to be baked in, 2018, the year before the election, we crossed an identity threshold, which a lot of people probably understand but haven't heard yet because you don't see it much in the media. It's almost too big a thought for the media to juggle at the moment. 2018 was the year we returned to majority migrant status as a nation. But over 29% of the population born overseas, 21% second generation, at least one parent a migrant. The last time we were above 50% was in the 1890s. But at the 1890s, we weren't looking at the equation as a majority migrant nation. We were looking at the equation from the other side of the ledger, which was we were about to become majority native born, as the phrase was at the time. Either you were born here, or your parents were born here, or your grandparents were born here. And the first draft of Australian identity was written then. It was written towards the late 1880s, early 1890s, and by the time of Federation. That Australia defined itself by who it excluded. Indigenous population not counted in the census, assumed to be a dying race. Deakin said in the White Australia debates in 1901 that we were smoothing the pillow for a dying race. The Chinese, the Japanese, all Asian migrants were excluded under White Australia policy, and we had about 7,000 Pacific Islanders who'd been recruited to work in the sugar fields in Queensland. Some of them kidnapped, many of them kidnapped. Formal apologies have been made since. They were deported. That was that country. That was the country that defined itself by who it didn't want to be. 2018, when we revert to majority migrant, we were a country that has to start thinking about including everybody in a 21st century definition of who we are as a people. Because when I alluded to earlier a southeast majority, that southeast majority is inevitable for demographic reasons, because most of the growth is down here. Now, when that happens, as I said, I don't want it to be a winner-take-all southeast majority. I don't want us to suddenly think we're a cosmopolitan country or Eurasian country and we forget about the other half of Australia. We forget about older Australia in terms of its age profile, regional Australia in terms of its disadvantage by place, whether it's young or old. So on your campuses, I'd like to hear these debates about who we are. It may not be a fashionable topic politically, but in terms of our national survival, in terms of our cohesion, it is a discussion we need to have. And in terms of your student bodies, plural, it's a discussion you need to have between them all, because they all get to run the country sooner or later. Now, again, some numbers to juggle here, but they're not big numbers, they're majority numbers. Majority migrant 2018. Only 4 capitals are majority migrant. Melbourne, Sydney, Perth and Canberra. Melbourne, Sydney and Perth are not just majority migrant, they are 2/3 migrant, first or second generation. It's quite epic numbers when you think about it. Perth, because of its mining boom. Melbourne and Sydney, obviously, because of Chinese, bolstered by Chinese and Indian immigration after the post-war wave from Southern Europe and then Southeast Asia. has roughly 60 to 65% either first or second generation migrant. It's one of the reasons why Sydney and Melbourne votes completely differently to the rest of the country, why Sydney and Melbourne look so different to the rest of the country. Now, Perth's a bit of an outlier because Perth is the place where the English do migrate to. And the Chinese aren't even in the top 5 ethnic data in Perth. It's the English one, the Kiwis too, but the South Africans are the dominant new arrival after the English. In Brisbane, where I did say the Kiwis are number 1 and the English are number 2, the Chinese and Indians are, in proportionate terms, where they were about 20 years ago in Melbourne and Sydney, 15 or 20 years ago in Melbourne and Sydney. So even there's a bit of a time lag in Brisbane. Canberra's the most interesting place in Australia today. Not only is it bang on the national average for first and second generation migrant, its top 5 migrants are in the same order as the nation at large. English 1, Chinese 2, Indians 3, New Zealanders 4, migrants from the Philippines number 5. It's the only city or region in Australia with a top 5 that matches the nation's ethnic face. Remember I said in 2001 it was virtually the same everywhere as it had been for the previous century. It's the same everywhere in just one place, Canberra. It's Eurasia in the southeast, it's Pacific in the north, and it's very Anglo on the Indian Ocean. Holding that country together, ethnicity is almost, it's the effect, not the cause. The thing that's driving the change is that most of the jobs after the end of the mining boom are down here. Melbourne, and in fact Melbourne is now behaving like it did during the gold rush, 1860s and 1870s, in terms of how it affects the rest of the country. Melbourne's been responsible for a quarter of all the population growth in Australia in the last 20 years. In the last 10, it's added 1 million people. It's gone from 4 to 5 million in the last 10. That million is 200,000 more than the addition of the population of Sydney in the same period. It's just under 100,000 more than the combined addition to the populations of Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide. So this city, that's why I picked up an extra seat at the last election through redistribution and could have got a second, is growing faster than any other region in the country at the moment. In fact, Melbourne's west is growing faster than the Gold Coast or the Sunshine Coast, traditional people magnets. Now, I describe Melbourne's effect on the regions as basically a one-way trade in people. Retirees move out, young kids move in, and then the migrants come in over the top. So Melbourne not only grows faster than the regions in Victoria, it stays younger relative to those regions. Outside of Geelong, every other regional town in Victoria today, and this story repeats in New South Wales, and it repeats in South Australia, and it repeats in Tasmania, has more people now, today, aged 65 and over, than 15 or under. The national story doesn't tell you that. In fact, when we look at our demography nationally, we say Australia is still relatively a young country. But in our regions, we've already got this thing that I describe as accelerated ageing. And accelerated ageing is occurring not because suddenly too many retirees started moving in this year or last year or the year before. It's because the population mix has changed. And the population mix has changed because the kids have moved out, retirees are moving in, the job market repositions for aged care, which accelerates the departure of kids. Now, most parts of Australia now rely on the overseas migration program for the majority of their growth. The regions can't compete with the cities, and that's the difference. But rather than tell you the story of a city versus a region, I'll give you the story of Melbourne versus Adelaide. So Adelaide has the misfortune of being too close to Melbourne. Adelaide is the first capital city. No disrespect, I love South Australia. In fact, it has my favourite Greek community in Australia, for the record. Sorry, Mum and Dad. Adelaide is going to be the first capital city, and it happens in 2021 according to the projections, where it has across the capital more people aged 65 and over than under 15. The first capital city that moves into that position. Its growth profile is that of a country town. So if I showed you the chart, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, straight line. Then if I showed you rest of Victoria, rest of New South Wales, Tasmania, rest of South Australia, Adelaide, they're all on the same line. If I showed you rest of Queensland, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, it's still growing. More like a city than a region, whereas Adelaide is more like a region than a city. Now I'm going to walk you through these. Just think about the composition of growth. Now the composition of growth, the reason why I'm talking about the composition of growth is the changes that have been underway in the 21st century, and the changes begin as an ageing equation and then is supersized by the migration program, because the migration program in a way is reacting to the ageing of the population, but it's not distributing the benefits of migration evenly. So you then get a separation by age. Now ethnicity is almost the wrong way to look at it, because you've got a lot of migrants in the regions, but they're just older. A lot of English, Italians, Greeks, and increasingly Vietnamese. So you look at any region in Australia and it looks like Australia in the 20th century. So I'm going to give you the Adelaide versus Melbourne story. Just give me 2 seconds to find it. Adelaide starts off, and this is an intriguing place for a capital city to be, but this is what the story in regional Australia looks like. It starts off having more people leave it each year than are born each year. So net natural increase in 2018 is 5,500. Net interstate migration, it's a minus not a plus, is just under 6,000. So they start 500 people behind, absent of overseas migration. So they need the overseas migration program to carry all their population growth. Now the people leaving Adelaide, most of them end up in Melbourne. Melbourne is a much bigger city, has obviously got slightly bigger net natural increase, but it's also picking up migrants from everywhere else. Brisbane's the only other capital that's picking up migrants from the rest of Australia. So Melbourne's plus 10,000 interstate migrants, and it's plus 37,500 net natural increase. Adelaide's at minus 500. Melbourne is already pushing 50,000, just through internal migration and net natural increase. Now 90,000 overseas born people chose either Melbourne or Adelaide in 2018. For Adelaide to keep up with Melbourne, it needs to catch 2/3 or 3/4 of that. It only got 10% of it. 10,000 went to Adelaide, 80,000 went to Melbourne. Melbourne grows, even though it's 3 times larger than Adelaide, grows 3 times larger than Adelaide. So its rate of growth is 3 times larger. Now there are these power relationships some of you would be aware of between big cities and regions. We're getting them between capital cities. Now I was looking for an American equivalent and somebody tells me it's the relationship between New York and Philadelphia. Philadelphia is just too close to New York to be able to keep up with New York. As I said, in that world it's going to be very difficult to hold Australia together where you've only got a couple of capital cities responsible for the majority of the skilled migrants that land, and in the end are responsible for the majority of the population. Not just the population growth, but the majority of economic growth. Sooner or later, power is going to transfer to the southeast. Now, for all you Labor people in the room, you might think, hooray, but the challenge to hold that country together is just as difficult as the challenge that Scott Morrison has today, which is trying to govern from regional Queensland and Western Australia. When you look at a budget, the people paying the taxes and the people receiving the benefits are sitting at opposite ends of the country. So your revenue raiser, and within your own campuses, obviously your fee-paying student is in that group, and your self-funded retiree, or your part pensioner, or your full pensioner, or your person on disability support, or person on only working part-time, they're in the other column. How do you convince both those sides to still talk to each other? Oh, the person paying a tax is happy for their taxes to be distributed as a benefit to the person who didn't want them there in the first place. These are very difficult conversations for the country to manage. Now, on your campuses, the more difficult immediate conversation, for my mind, is because government has put you in the situation of ramping up the fee-paying side of the equation, and because the economy, for survival reasons alone, because of ageing, is importing many more foreign students than we've ever had the pleasure of hosting. Because most of them are from China and India, they're coming from rising countries. They're coming from rising countries that ultimately are going to determine our fate in the 21st century in an Asian or Eurasian century. Our negotiating position in the region, and this is in the national security and foreign affairs space, will be influenced by the way, ultimately by the way students are treated on campus. Now, I don't want to make that too heavy a burden, but remember that for those of you who understand the way the Colombo Plan was structured, the Colombo Plan was structured to educate Asia's elites so they wouldn't blow up Australia, honestly. That was the thinking in the 50s and 60s. Now, obviously, we're not going to get blown up. No one wants to hurt us. But we don't want, there's a couple of things we don't want. We don't want to be so reliant on skilled migration and foreign income sources that we haven't thought what happens if one of the groups decides to go home or chooses a market, and I hate that word, but chooses a market that's more responsive to their needs. And don't think we're not in a competition. Globally, we're in a competition. Just that our ageing story is occurring a little slower than it is elsewhere. Everybody else has got the same problems. Every rich nation's got the same problems. Their birth rate fell off the cliff at some point in the 70s, and now their boomers are retiring. So increasingly they're relying on the overseas migration program to keep their economies afloat. So that competition, think about what that competition means for your campuses. That competition becomes really, really interesting if there are a couple of players out there who start recruiting for best practices that you theorise about, but you never really had because you're too busy or had other things to juggle, or you had presentations to give to government, too busy to make that front of mind. So I would consider the structure I'm presenting for you. You don't have to. You can interrogate it. You don't have to take it as gospel, but consider this structure which impacts your politics and impacts the separation of your cities from the rest of the country is your reality every day. So the national picture, beyond the interest of your campus, the national picture is just as important as anything else. A politician will walk in and tell you, third biggest exporter, hooray for education. The education system tell politicians, third biggest exporter, a lot of systems risks if we don't maintain the value of the brand of Australia as a country of choice for people to move to, for mobile, skilled and increasingly, fussy is not a bad word, fussy migrants, and we're good host. We know we're a good host because we're the first country back to majority migrant. New Zealand is a couple of points behind us and Canada a couple of points again. In the US and the UK, by the way, fewer than 30% of first or second generation migrant. So they have a big baked-in native-born population that, wants to separate from the global economy at the moment. We're not in that headspace. But we do have, especially because we're running so quickly on this grand experiment of education as a massive export earner, we are running an experiment in real time about how we make this thing work properly. Now, I haven't discussed any of the specifics. It says 10 minutes to go. 10:30. Okay, so I'm well and truly over time. There's time for questions, I think. You always get the sense it's time for questions. Now, please remind delegates that all questions will be asked through the conference app. In the app, click to the program, join poll. Have I got any questions? Or Luke, do you want to moderate them for me?
Yeah, let's go.
I've never done this before. Thank you.